What is something that was crazy at the time but proven to be correct? Story 1. I can't remember what I read it in recently, but when some scientist fella in the early part of last century came away with the theory that the continents moved, he was ridiculed, and the whole continental drift thing wasn't accepted as true until at least the 1950s. Something is making me think even as late as the 70s, but I'll stick with the 50s. Growing up, I learned all about it. Supercontinents that drifted apart and created the land masses we have today, and which are all still moving and changing due to continental drift. It's mad to think that the accepted science I know wasn't properly accepted until 40 years before I learned it in school. Story 2. The man on Twitter that said he could hear Yiddish and banging under his NYC apartment and was convinced there were Jews living under him, but everyone online was convinced he was schizophrenic. Months later, Jews were, in fact, found living underground in the same area of this man's apartment. Story 3. There were reports of ancient records written on metal plates, and at first archaeologists thought that was insane, that no civilization would use precious metals for writing. Since then, several ancient records have been found on various metals, including bronze, zinc, silver, and even gold. And Story 4. The theory of plate tectonics was widely ridiculed when it was first proposed. Everybody had observed that the east coast of the Americas and the west coast of Europe, Africa, correlate pretty strongly. But nobody could propose a mechanism, so any suggestion of an actual connection was pretty quickly discounted. Now it's part of the standard. Story 5. Basically, as soon as Google Maps was released, I was like, oh shit, I kinda don't like they are tracking our location all the time. They aren't tracking our location all the time. How in the flying fuck do you think they are giving you accurate traffic reports on every route you can imagine in the country immediately, if not from collecting real-time data from drivers currently on those routes? They aren't tracking our location all the time. 6 years later. Google has been tracking our locations this whole time? Yes, dumbass. Story 6. Ignaz Semmelweis was working in a delivery ward and noticed a much higher mortality rate coming from the physician's wing than the student physician residence wing. The physicians were doing procedures all day long, and the students would usually get 1 or 2 a day. Dr. Semmelweis proposed that germs and microscopic pieces of flesh and blood were contaminating procedures. His solution was, wash your hands between patients. This was met with outrage, and he was committed to an insane asylum where he died. After his death, the medical community figured out he was absolutely correct. Story 7. We tend to think of the unsinkable claims about the Titanic as irrational, given that the first thing one learns about the Titanic is that it sank. But the idea of it sinking was genuinely unfathomable, and in fact delayed evacuation efforts because a lot of passengers dismissed the possibility that the ship was sinking. On top of that, a lot of people dismissed the eyewitness accounts that the ship broke apart as it sank. It was an incredibly unlikely thing to happen, and not all survivors observed it. It wasn't fully accepted until Robert Ballard discovered the wreck. Another fun fact. The idea that it could have broken apart helped him locate the wreck. He realized that if it was in 2 pieces, he could look for a debris field instead of just trying to find the ship itself, which gave him a much larger area to search within. Story 8. The King Charles II of England agreed to a treaty in 1670 that stipulated that he convert to Catholicism and attack the Protestant Netherlands in exchange for subsidies from France. Plus, he could call on French troops to put down any threats to his rule. All of this is insane. England was a fiercely Protestant country, and if the opposition had known that Charles had agreed to this, he could have been deposed. It sounded too bizarre to be true. After all, the super-Protestants had relied on lies in other instances during the reign of Charles II to get their way. But a copy of the treaty was found in an archive in the 1770s, a conspiracy theory proven correct. Story 9. Netherlands. The Toeslagen affair, a social benefits scandal. People got social benefits, but because the government was overly strict on fraud, they invented this system where if you would make one tiny mistake, you would have to pay back all the money. So if you filed a claim with the wrong date, all the alarms would go off. If you had to pay back money and you paid euro 100 too little, that surely meant you are a criminal. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but if you had to pay back all money, it could mean they had to pay back 20 euros, and this is for people who generally don't have much money. The result, you could lose your house, go bankrupt, and because of all the stress you could end up with a divorce, no job, and your kids taken away. This all happened, and it happened with tens of thousands of people. You may thank neoliberal policy. Story 10. About 10 years ago, anytime we used to do yearly N95 mask testing for tuberculosis patients, They would have you discard your mask on the way out. I saved all of mine BC in the event of a pandemic. I figured they might get hard to come by and I would want them. Everybody laughed and jabbed me for being a doomsday prepper. I was not actually expecting to be proven right, but there we were. And I with the masks. Story 11. Epigenetics influences gestation and prenatal gene expression. Anyone who tried to claim that a fetus develops both via genetics and in tandem with the mother's environment was laughed out of scientific meetings. In 2009. It took another 10 years for the scientific community to say, I guess it is both nature and nurture. The scientists' careers they ruined remain ruined. Story 12. The Horizon Scandal in the UK. Between 1999 and 2015, over 900 postmasters in the UK were tried and convicted of fraud and theft from the post office. Some went to prison. Some were ordered to make up the shortfall out of their wages. Some took their own lives. It was known by the top brass that the discrepancies were due to errors in the accounting software, but they didn't want to admit to fucking everything up, so they blamed the postmasters instead. There was a documentary on ITV, and people are signing petitions to have those who involved in the cover-up face justice. They're rich and well-connected, though, so they probably won't. Story 13. That the Titanic broke apart when it sank. It was dark, and witness testimonies were mixed, so the official inquests went with what the highest-ranking surviving officers said, that it sank in one piece. It wasn't until the wreck site was discovered in the 80s that it was proven to have broken apart. That's why movies like A Night to Remember show it sinking intact. The 1998 James Cameron film was the first major Titanic film to show it breaking. It's been suggested that the officers who testified at the inquest were actually aware the ship had broken apart as it sank, but were under pressure from their employers to keep it to themselves to protect the reputation of the company. Conveniently, most of the people who said it did break were passengers, especially women and children, watching from the lifeboats, who were seen as less reliable than the officers. Story 14. Microbiology started with Dutch scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek in 1676. He was often disregarded because of his talk of little animals that are so tiny you can't see them with the naked eye. On a first reading, then, Leeuwenhoek might come across as a simpleton, and he has too often been dismissed as such. One can only smile at the image of Leeuwenhoek on the beach, pressing his pre-prepared bottles onto strangers. He proved his contemporaries wrong with his simple, single-lensed microscopes. Story 15. Amazon. Amazon is also a prime example of a company ahead of its time. Who needs a virtual bookstore when they can go to bookstore chains across the U.S. like Barnes and Nobles or Borders? In the memories of many Americans, the scene of them sitting at a bookstore for hours, drinking coffee, and reading completely free books or magazines has become extremely vivid. Yet it turns out that there are many people who love a virtual bookstore. Of course, real-life bookstores do not like this. This story leads to one conclusion. Never underestimate the appeal of sitting lazily at home in pajamas. Story 16. PayPal. PayPal's early users must have been a little crazy to trust the brand. They gave their bank account and email address to a company that was not affiliated with the bank and had a childish name. If it had been born at a different time in history, would PayPal have achieved success? This no one can answer. But the company's founders also acknowledged that PayPal's prosperity was born out of a lack of high-tech means of payment in the late 1990s and an aversion to local inspection. Email only. This strange idea later attracted the attention of many large investors and businesses such as Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. Story 17. Craigslist is one of the most popular classifieds websites in the world, where you can find almost anything, whether it's a job, an apartment, a girlfriend, or entertainment. But the special thing about this website is that it is a garage for people to post and sell all sorts of things, both high and low, completely free. Since its inception, the website's interface has remained almost unchanged, and people love it because of its somewhat ugly simplicity. The site has been under fire for some time due to security and safety concerns. The founder of Craigslist, Mr. Craig Newmark, never put profits first for this website, but his brainchild has grown stronger than many other profit-oriented websites. And until nowadays, this is still the dominant website in the online classifieds market in the U.S. Story 18. Stone Pets. This product was just revived in 2012, and before that, in the 1970s, it brought extreme success to the owner of the idea, Gary Dahl. In 1975, while sitting in a bar and listening to his friends complaining about how troublesome it was to keep pets, this man suddenly came up with the idea of stone pets, which of course they were. Very easy to care for. Back home, he wrote a 32-page guidebook with countless funny stories, such as requests to play dead. These pets were very cheap, only 1 penny per stone. Badal later earned 15 million USD. Story 19. The Great Debate in Astronomy between Harlow Shapley and Heber Curtis. Shapley believed that spiral galaxies, like Andromeda, were small and nebulae like clouds within the Milky Way, itself at the time thought to be the entire universe. Curtis thought they were massive structures far away. This debate was held in 1920. In the later 1920s, Edwin Hubble proved Curtis's theory right. It's kind of mind-boggling just how much technology has advanced and how much of the universe we've learned in just the past century. Story 20. The Far Right. Warning about Pakistani grooming gangs in the UK, targeting underage white girls. People just dismissed them as racists. It didn't help when one of them made a video, trying to warn people about this problem. Sounded like he was saying ray guns instead of rape gangs. The left laughed themselves silly over that. It even became a meme. They thought it was hilarious. Until the next year it all come out. It was finally proven. Up and down the country, thousands of underage white girls were groomed and raped by Pakistani Muslims. Some of the victims were as young as 8. The victims were also all from white working-class areas. Victims reported that they were told this was happening because they were white, because they are not Muslim, because they are not covered. It's believed that Muslim politicians in areas this happened knew and tried to cover it up. And they're not the only ones. The British police also didn't take the report seriously, as they didn't want to be accused of racism or Islamophobia, so turned a blind eye to it. The amount of victims is crazy, BTY. Pakistanis are a minority in the UK, yet they have caused all this. To this day, the British left still make jokes about ray guns. Despite what the guy in question was actually trying to say, it's a big part of why a lot of us in the UK who are working class despise the left, especially Labour, despite that party once being the party of working class people, because we know they don't care about us. We found that out the hard way. They get more upset about Islamophobia, racism, if you even bring it up. Sadly, it's believed the problem is still ongoing. Story 21. One notable example of something considered crazy at the time, but later proven to be correct, is the theory of plate tectonics. In the early 20th century, scientists like Alfred Wegener proposed the idea that continents were not fixed in place, but instead drifted over time. Wegener's theory, known as continental drift, was met with skepticism and even ridicule by many in the scientific community. Story 22. COVID-19 coronavirus origins. Still not fully proven though, but FBI says they think it came from labs since the lab sickness started in November while Wuhan people got sick in December. Facebook and Twitter censored Hunter laptop stories because they declared it fake through guidance from FBI and CIA. Both incidents, which were called crazy right-wing conspiracy theorists, except a year later it became well known, especially the undoubtedly Hunter Biden fiasco. All right, let's take the political pot stirrers out. How about one so old that nobody is going to be against it? Semmelweis believed in hand-washing to prevent disease in 1858, but everyone thought he was a crazy man. Him washing hands saved countless lives as babies were constantly dying in hospitals because of dirty doctors touching the baby. Doctors hated him because he made a mockery of their knowledge and they didn't want to accept the fact that their own hands had killed so many babies. After being fired and having no institutions try out his hand-washing hypothesis, Semmelweis went mad and was forced to live in an asylum. Story 23. Herodotus described that sailors who sailed south along the African coast saw the sun rise in the north instead of the south. Many at the time thought this proved Herodotus was peddling absurd rumors. Even Herodotus himself expresses doubt about it in the text. But he was in fact correct, as the sun does that when you cross the equator. He also wrote that the Nile floods were caused by melting snows. Again, people thought this absurd. How can you have snow in the blisteringly hot and dry south? He was again proved correct, as the snows are on Kilimanjaro. Story 24. Quantum mechanics. The idea is still honestly a bit baffling and requires insane things to make it work. But the issue is, it does work, period. It's an accurate description of reality at certain levels, even if that requires multiple realities or whatever other nonsense. There's a good reason Einstein was so against it, even if he was wrong in the end. Story 25. A lot in science, but I think plate tectonics really rates up there. It's such a very basic concept now about how large-scale geology works. But the early proponents of the theory faced intense criticism from their academic peers, many of whom were still bound by religious dogma that held that the world never changes. This was only about 100 years ago, which is kinda mind-blowing considering how fundamental it to essentially everything in geology now. Story 26. Global warming. Arrhenius had a crude model in the 1890s. Nobody paid attention then, either. But I'm walking around in a t-shirt in a Chicago winter. Germ theory, and specifically antibody theory, the whole cowpox vaccination, and then the scare about what it gonna change yous to a cow in it.